Patience. It's the first thing that goes out the window when I get tired. My fuse shortens, and the little things that normally I find cute or funny or even endearing in my children all of a sudden become thorns in my side. It's something that I didn't really notice about myself till recently. Thankfully, with Crystal's gentle help, I've slowly gotten a little bit better at recognizing when I've moved past my normally pretty laid-back attitude into my tired dad mode. I've noticed that the first thing that I usually get irritated with is all of the little messes that our 3 little boys leave scattered around our house. For some reason, it's probably rooted in my childhood, the things that I can walk right past for like 2 or 3 days and not notice or care anything about whatsoever suddenly become the most impossible to ignore, vile things that I've ever laid eyes on. And they need to be cleaned up immediately. It's usually when we're doing our bedtime routine at our house and the boys, like usual, probably like most children, are doing absolutely everything that they can think of so that they can stay up just a little bit longer. Griffin is all of a sudden in need of a shower. He needs to put on his deodorant. He needs to stand in front of the mirror and gel his hair just perfectly before he can brush his teeth and climb into bed. Everett is, for some reason, chasing the cats all over the house, trying to capture them for his pretend wild animal menagerie. And Wyatt, our 11-year-old, is in desperate need to organize every single Lego that he has ever owned into color-coded piles. And that's when I, for some reason, see for the first time all of the little piles of stuff that they've left all over the house. That the random collection of stuffed animals that have been lovingly and carefully crammed underneath the couch, or the shoebox full of all of the old toys and a half-chewed piece of gum, or the toothbrush that Griffin swore that he couldn't find 2 minutes ago that I've now found jammed between the books on the bookshelf in the hallway, and they are all now covered in hardened toothpaste. That's when I lose my cool. That's when I demand that everything in the house is scrubbed down and spotless before anybody gets to go to bed. That's when I'm most likely to say things that I know that I'm going to regret in the morning. And that's when Crystal gives me the look that I have come to respect and realize that I need. The one that tells me that I've gone round the bend. It's in those moments that I allow my emotions to take over. I become intoxicated, not by alcohol or anything like that, but by my own flaws. The flaws that have become enhanced by exhaustion. And I no longer think clearly. For me, it happens when I'm tired. For you, it might be something else. All of us have this tendency to allow our emotions to become hijacked by something, spinning us into these dangerous territories where we're far more likely to do and to say things that we never would have otherwise. And that's where the book of Esther begins. In that danger zone where mistakes are being made, where words are being said, where lives are changed forever. We're in the second week of our walk through the book of Esther. And we haven't even opened up this book yet. Last week I gave you an overview of some of the major characters that we're going to be spending some time with as we walk through this book of the Bible. And tonight we're going to watch as this story opens up with a dramatic scene at the king's royal party. A scene that ends up changing history for both the Persians and the Hebrews. The first few years after being crowned the King of Kings, as the Persians called their rulers, Xerxes the Great had already led his army all of the way down to Egypt so that he could quell a rebellion that had started there when he took over as ruler. And then he had to go put down 2 citywide revolts that had sprung up in the ancient city Babylon, which was the capital of the previous empire that his grandfather had conquered. And when we meet him in the opening of the book of Esther, his reign really wasn't going as smoothly as I'm sure he would have hoped. The author of Esther tells us in the first chapter, as this book opens, that we're now 3 years into his reign, and Xerxes puts on this gigantic banquet for all of the princes and the rulers and the nobles in his empire. It was this grand party that lasted about 6 months. Scripture tells us it was 180 days exactly. And then after that's finished, he is said to have thrown a grand banquet for the common people in the courtyards of his palace gardens. We get this beautiful picture of what it looked like in verse 6 and 7 of the book of Esther. Here's what it said. The courtyards were beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings, which were fastened with white linen cords and purple ribbons to silver rings embedded in the marble pillars. Gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine, reflecting the king's generosity. By edict of the king, no limits were placed on the drinking, for the king had instructed all of his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. That sounds pretty good. That sounds like an absolute blast to me. Now, what we're not told by the author of this book is that during this time, during this 180-day feast and banquet, Xerxes' armies were gathering and training troops. They were building weapons and armor and siege equipments. They were gathering food and supplies for hundreds of thousands of men to march off to war. And at the command of the king, they were also digging the Xerxes Canal at the base of Mount Athos on the peninsula of Chalkidon in northern Greece. To give you an idea of what an undertaking this was in the year 485 BC, and just how serious Xerxes was about avenging his father's failure to dominate Greece and Sparta, here's a quick picture of what that canal looks like, taken from 14 miles up into the stratosphere. It was dug completely by hand using picks and shovels so that his ships could sail straighter and faster into battle. That's a pretty huge undertaking for that year. And so when we read in the first chapter of the book of Esther of the opulence and the extreme wealth of the king, the amount of money that this guy was spending on this 6-month-long party for the nobles and the week-long party for the common people, it's helpful for us, at least it's helpful for me, to remember that he wasn't just spending cash because he wanted to spend some cash, right? He wasn't just this flamboyant, conceited ruler. He wasn't some lazy partier who was spending all of his daddy's money. This was a brilliant, calculated king who had just quelled 2 rebellions in the old capital city of Babylon. He had crushed another rebellion down in Egypt, and he was about to march off to the most famous battle in all of world history, with the largest army ever assembled. I'm guessing that he was probably trying to gain as many political points as he possibly could with all of his princes and all of the nobles before this guy was gone for a couple of years fighting the Greeks. He was going to be going up against the Spartans. And my guess is that this guy wanted to come home to an empire that was still there, an empire that was still his. We're also told that his military officers were invited to this party as well, which probably helped him gain their loyalty and affection before this grueling march that would take months and months until they were off in battle. So here's where things start getting interesting in this story. In verse 9, we're told that the queen, Vashti, is also entertaining during this celebration. She invites all of the women to this banquet that was taking place inside the royal palace. It was this beautiful event with all of the best foods and wines, and it must have been quite the lavish affair. Until the king made a very particular request of the queen. But before we get to that request, what is it that we know about Queen Vashti, right? What do we know about this queen? It's actually harder to piece together who she was than you would think. The historical Jewish writings, like the Midrash, tell us that she is the great granddaughter of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. She's also the daughter of King Belshazzar. And on the night that the Persians captured the capital city of Babylon, remember that story that you can read from Daniel chapter 5 with the writing on the wall? You remember that? Well, she's there during that attack. And the young Vashti runs to the royal bedroom looking for her father, only to run into the Persian king Darius, who spares her life, kidnaps her, and he raises her in this new empire that he's carved from the ashes of her home. And King Darius eventually marries her off to his son Xerxes, combining both the destroyed kingdom of Babylon and this brand new empire of Persia into this one royal marriage. But in the different cultural and historical views, Queen Vashti is seen from several different angles and through very, very different lenses. For instance, the feminists see her as this heroine, right? This woman who stood up to her husband, paving the way for other women to see themselves not just as property or sexual objects or walking baby factories, but as humans, as people who are worthy of respect on their own, and not because of who they were or weren't married to, or because of whose daughter they were, but because they were actually people. For the historian, Queen Vashti is seen as this brilliant political strategist and this survivor who, in a moment of anger and frustration, makes a critical mistake. And for the Hebrew people, she is seen as this wicked woman who was stricken by God with leprosy and even had the archangel Michael himself come down and affix a tail to her disfigured body as a physical sign of just how monstrous she was on the inside. But the book of Esther really only tells us that she was commanded by her drunken husband, the king, to come parade herself around the banquet in her royal crown so that all of the men of the kingdom, not just the nobles and the princes, but all of the commoners as well, could see just how beautiful she was. And accounts vary, but it's assumed by some that she was told to wear only her royal crown, which was why she refused the king and stayed at her party inside of the royal palace. And at her refusal, the king, who at this point is stumbling, drunk, and furious, turns to his advisors and asks them what the law allows him to do in order to punish her for her insolence. Here's verse 15 of what the king says. "What must be done to Queen Vashti?" the king demanded. "What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders, properly sent through his eunuchs?" You could just imagine this scene, right? Can't you? An incredibly opulent party filled with drunk men and scantily clad women, serving them all of the food and the alcohol that they could possibly want and ask for. And this drunken, scorned king, somebody who's never been told no by anybody, bragging about how beautiful his wife is. This locker room talk, right? Wanting to show off for all of these guys just how lucky he is. And then he's publicly humiliated, not only in front of all of the nobles, but also in front of his military leaders and these peasants. I would be angry too, but he is outraged. And so he turns to his advisors, right? Men that he's handpicked to counsel him on affairs of state and law and military and all kinds of politics and economics and palace intrigue, right? Men who've gotten to know him over the last 3 years, and they know what he wants to hear. They know how to talk to him. They know how to appease him, especially, I'm assuming, when he's fuming, especially when he's drunk. And so they tell him what he wants to hear. Not what's right, not what it is that he's doing wrong, not what would be best for him and what would be best for the empire. They tell him what he wants to hear. Here's verse 16. "Memucan answered the king and his nobles, quote, 'Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your entire empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to their contempt and their anger. So, if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and the Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. Right? This isn't just a single moment. This is something that's huge. It's going to affect everybody, right? Can't you just hear an angry, drunken king slurring this decree while having this jeweled goblet waving around in his hand, sloshing wine all over the place? So the king takes the advice of his counselors, the men who, if they were lucky, might just personally benefit if the king was to choose a new queen, because traditionally, the king would only wed women of noble houses, right? As a way of keeping the peace, of consolidating power, to make sure that people weren't rising up against him. Though his harem could include pretty much anybody and everybody that he found physically attractive. But if Xerxes were to choose one of their daughters, one of these men would rise significantly in power and prestige. And so, the decree that the king had made in all of his fury went out to the entire kingdom, all of the land. Here's verse 21. The king and his nobles thought this made good sense. So he followed Memucan's counsel. He sent letters to all parts of the empire, to each province in its own script and language, proclaiming that every man should be the ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases. Sounds pretty good, right? And then chapter 2 begins. Things take a little bit different tone. But after Xerxes' anger had subsided, he began thinking about Vashti and what she had done and the decree that he had made. You can kind of feel the regret, right? You ever said something in a moment of anger that you later regretted? Have you ever done something while you weren't actually thinking straight? You ever done something you wish you could take back? For some of us, it's in moments of rage. For some, it's things that happen while we've been under the influence of alcohol. But I think that we can all recognize that it's not just anger and drunkenness that have the ability to cloud our judgment and influence us in negative ways. It's things like bitterness, frustration, pain, lust, pride. All of them can drag us into decisions that we regret when we snap out of it, when we step back and we're able to think clearly again. And Xerxes here isn't the exception to the rule. He is the rule. We all do this. He is a warning that when we allow ourselves to be completely overcome with emotion, or we allow anything, frankly, to cloud our ability to think and to act clearly, we've strayed into very dangerous territory where the people that we love most are likely to get hurt, including us. And let me assure you, the passion and intensity aren't bad things that we need to stoically bury deep down inside of us and always think logically, like some kind of Vulcan that you would see in a Star Wars movie, right? There's a reason that the fruit of the Spirit, which Paul writes about in the book of Galatians, includes self-control. There's a reason that the followers of Jesus are called to hold each other accountable. There is a reason that we don't want ourselves, and especially our leaders, to be surrounded only by people who just agree with us and tell us what we want to hear. There's a reason that we should all be concerned with only listening to the people who already agree with us. We need to come to the point where we can confront ourselves when we recognize that we've become firmly rooted in our own echo chambers, just like Xerxes was. And look, I get it. It's natural to go looking for the people and the ideas that make us feel comfortable, right? That make us feel safe. It's natural to not want to be challenged and to not have people push us to grow. But it's in those challenging moments and in those challenging conversations when we're held accountable that we're actually able to grow and become more mature. That's one of the many ways that God chisels and shapes us into who we were designed to be. Xerxes, right? Drunk and angry, he makes this terrible mistake. And as we'll see next week, God continues to work for good and does what God does best and makes something beautiful out of the ashes of our failure. My ask of you this week is for you to sit down with one or more of the people that God has placed in your life. The people that you trust, the people that have earned the right to speak into your life. And ask them to show you some of the places where you have room to grow. Make that phone call or sit down for coffee and ask them to give you some honest feedback. Seek out their wisdom and the things that they see that you might not. And then, after those fun conversations, sit down with God and ask for the wisdom to know where to start and the courage and the strength to actually do it. Because the more we become like Christ, the more we're able to live lives that showcase the kingdom of heaven here on earth.